inizio in italiano, poi, come dicevo, if there are some friends who are less proficient in Italian, we can switch to English. Let us know. In ogni caso, è con, come dire, con grande trepidazione, con grande apprensione e dolore, diciamo così, che abbiamo deciso di tenere questo webinar. Ne avevamo fatti altri su questi temi, sul tema della Bielorussia prima e poi 2 sull'Ucraina, qualche settimana, qualche mese fa e qualche settimana fa. La situazione è evidentemente degenerata, come tutti sapete, e ci troviamo in un vero e proprio conflitto che definirei un conflitto non solo in Ucraina, ma contro l'Ucraina e probabilmente anche contro il resto del mondo, o almeno la civilizzazione come noi la intendiamo. Io non è neanche il caso di usare aggettivi, perché persone molto più capaci di me lo hanno fatto e hanno descritto quello che proviamo, quello che sta succedendo, semplicemente al di là di ogni, come dire, beyond beliefs, dell'immaginabile, di vivere quello che stiamo vivendo. Peraltro c'è una dimensione c'è una dimensione del conflitto che ha così tanti elementi, così tante strade, così tanti fili, che è difficile anche parlarne, e anche degli sviluppi di ora in ora che si accavallano. Avete visto la decisione di questi minuti, direi, americana di far passare alla Polonia degli aerei militari di fabbricazione ancora sovietica all'Ucraina, cosa che prima non era stata autorizzata. Per affrontare tutti questi temi abbiamo 3 ospiti veramente di eccezione, peraltro tre amici, 3 persone che appartengono alle nostre chat e che, a mio avviso, hanno un'esperienza di prima mano di quello che sta succedendo, e diciamo non sono solo studiosi, ma sono anche persone che vivono quello che sta succedendo. Sono Domitilla Sagramoso, con cui comincerei. Domitilla è researcher e senior lecturer al Department of War Studies del King's College di Londra. Con lei abbiamo già parlato nei mesi scorsi dei temi est europei, appunto dalla Bielorussia all'Ucraina, e Domitilla è, diciamo così, un po' il punto di riferimento per tutte le nostre conversazioni su questi temi. Domitilla, te ne siamo grati, non sappiamo veramente come esprimere questa gratitudine nei tuoi confronti, perché sei stata, diciamo così, una sorta se posso dire, di Beatrice nel guidarci nel comprendere quello che sta succedendo, anche se forse è più un inferno, quindi più un Virgilio che un paradiso. Abbiamo poi l'ambasciatore Marco Peronaci, che è il nostro rappresentante permanente dell'Italia presso il Comitato Politico e di Sicurezza dell'Unione Europea, quello che sta decidendo sostanzialmente la posizione dell'Unione Europea sull'Ucraina. E quindi, Marco, in questo momento veramente ti ringraziamo, perché sappiamo anche i ritmi e le pressioni che persone come te in quella posizione hanno in questo momento. E poi abbiamo un economista, la nostra Silvia Merler, che segue questi temi molto da vicino, che sta capendo qual è l'impatto non solo delle sanzioni sull'economia russa, ma anche l'impatto del conflitto, della guerra, delle sanzioni, ma al di là delle sanzioni, sulle nostre economie. Silvia è Head of Policy Research presso Algebris. Io mi fermo qua, ringrazio tutti gli amici di M&M, dell'associazione, tutti gli amici delle chat che sono presenti, vi vedo molto numerosi, e con un unico punto, diciamo così, di house kitchen, che è che il seminario, consideriamolo come un seminario aperto, pubblico. C'è una registrazione, quindi nessuna informazione riservato, sensibile può essere divulgata. Mi fermo qua e, come deciso precedentemente, darei la parola a Domitilla, che ci parla appunto degli aspetti politici geopolitici che riguardano il conflitto, ma anche un po' la Russia. Grazie.
Grazie ancora Fabrizio per questo invito, è sempre veramente un grande piacere condividere le mie idee con voi. Volevo dare un po' un panorama della situazione a livello della, insomma, in Ucraina, e poi se volete farmi delle domande sulla situazione all'interno della Russia più specifiche, sono pronta a rispondere, però volevo un po' spiegare come vedo le problematiche e diversi scenari, diciamo, se è possibile. Sì? Proverò a condividere questa piantina. Una piantina, adesso non trovo. Vabbè, era una piantina che indicava più o meno la situazione, eccola. La situazione attuale, se vogliamo un po' capire qual è insomma la cartina sul terreno. I think I'm going to switch to English because I prepared this and I'm sometimes more comfortable, but of course, Fabrizio, let me know if there are things that need clarification also in Italian.
I think everybody's comfortable with English. Don't go ahead, please.
So I think, as we all know, maybe I'm saying things we all know, but you know, it's clear that Russia is having great difficulties in completing successfully its military campaign. It is advancing in the south and in the east, but these advances are coming at quite a very high cost. There are serious problems around logistics, around morale, around coordination and communication. And it is clear now that the sort of blitzkrieg campaign that Putin and his team were hoping to achieve and succeed failed. The Russian armed forces were not really able to carry out an effective initial campaign. And more importantly, they were not properly prepared and they didn't really develop all the capabilities for a longer campaign. We are also seeing problems to fully control the airspace over the last week. And there have been reports that the Russian Air Force has not really been able to operate effectively in a more complex, hostile environment. So really, we are starting to see one of the first conclusions is that the Russian military potential and capabilities is really not as strong as we expected, and it's not performing well. And of course, on the other side, they're facing an opponent who is ready to resist very effectively so far. Of course, with some serious difficulties, but much better than we expected. And I think that now the arrival of Western supplies seems to be showing a more important impact. Yesterday, there was a bit of a sort of a strategic pause, and it's not clear whether Russia is now going to sort of launch a much more sort of brutal campaign over cities like Kiev and Odessa and Mikhailov in the south. So it's not very clear. What is clear is that Russia is resorting to indiscriminate violence, and its campaign is very much intended to create sort of as much fear as possible. The idea is that people or the government sort of, to a certain extent, surrender or reach an agreement which is favorable to Russia, sort of what we used to call strategic bombardment, so that people sort of in some way demand some kind of surrender. And at the tactical level, that the cities become sort of uninhabitable, so that there is sort of less resistance when the armed forces advance. So very much of the bombing of these cities has a double objective of sort of on a strategic level and also on a tactical level. There were many problems that Russia were facing, and one of them that I think is now coming out is the fact that there was a lot of problem internally with communications and preparation, and they had very poor intelligence. And I think this is very interesting, and I wanted to highlight this, is because these reports are coming out through Bellingcat, that intelligence officers were providing the intelligence that the politicians wished to have, a bit like Iraq in 2003. So there was fear of providing more effective and correct intelligence, for fear of being dismissed, of being seen as a traitor. And also this idea that that nobody ever really told people within the FSB on the intelligence agencies that they had to prepare scenarios of these kind of operations. And everything was really based very much on Ukrainians sort of provoking the Russians into an attack. So very few were really prepared for this kind of scenario. And that is really very interesting. So sort of how the intelligence was shared and why there is apparently very strong frustration inside the Kremlin now because of the way the campaign is going. Now to the question, what are the two scenarios? What if Russia succeeds? If it after a very long campaign, it sort of achieves its a kind of military victory? And what are the implications? I mean, first of all, I think that this cannot be discounted. Maybe after a long campaign and a high number of civilian casualties, we could see sort of a Russian victory with which anyways achieved at a very high cost for Russia with a demoralized armed forces, Ukraine completely destroyed in terms of infrastructure, economy, a high cost for Russia to sort of redevelop this country, and also with a big challenge of how to occupy and subdue such a big territory with a hostile population. So I think Russia would face serious challenges, even if it succeeded after several weeks in sort of moving towards Kiev, taking Kiev from the south. But I think that this faces serious challenges because of, as we know, I mean, there are reports that the Russian armed forces could only sort of be able to hold or to carry on a campaign for another maybe 3 weeks. And then they would really start facing serious problems. Here, to me, the big question, and this is what I would like to ask my other panelists, is, especially Marco, is how would the West react to that? I mean, are we ready? Are we getting ready for a sort of a defeat? And how would the EU react to a situation when sort of the Ukrainians might not be able really to continue fighting? They might have the fighting spirit, but not the capabilities. And I think this is something that I'm very interested in. You know, are we getting sort of a plan B situation when Ukraine is no longer sort of led by a leader who is sort of pro EU? This would be very hard to achieve, but I think it's something that we should not discard. The problem or the scenario we're seeing now is that that Putin feels or may feel that he's failing, and he might be ready to escalate. It is clear that Putin is now risking not only his own sort of internal domestic position, but from his point of view, he will be thinking that the fate of the entire country, of the entire Russia now rests on this campaign. So I think this is also something that we really need to bear in mind. It's not so much how he perceives his own position of power and of survival of the regime, but also that probably he would think and he would try to convince anyone around him that this war needs to be won because the fate of Russia as a state is at stake. And if it gets lost, Russia will appear very weak. And many regions inside Russia, especially those inhabited by non-ethnic Russians, might feel sort of a momentum to sort of challenge the authority of the Kremlin. And the serious concern about potential disintegration of the country, which is always an issue of concern in Russia, might again come back and create a lot of concern. So the big question now is whether Putin is ready to fight till the end. And the two sort of the big points that are being raised now is whether Russia would be ready to use tactical nuclear weapons. I think that although this is not highly likely, it no longer has to be discarded. So I think here we really need a red flag. And my hope is that a very strong message is sent to the Russian leadership that if tactical nuclear weapons are used in the battlefield, that would immediately produce some kind of response from the West. That this is completely unacceptable. But I think I will explain in detail, if you wish, why I think this is now something that we need to really worry about. I wouldn't also discard, for similar reasons, that Putin may decide, for example, to use chemical weapons, as Assad did in the outskirts of Damascus in 2013 and 2018, which proved, unfortunately, quite successful. And we see that there is a lot of sort of false flag and efforts to kind of show that probably is going to blame the Ukrainians for that. But I think this is also something that we might have to consider. And therefore, I think these are questions that we really, here in the West, we really need to think about very seriously. I think I'm going to stop now, Fabrizio. I'm sorry if I went on for too long.
No, that's okay. I think that was indeed what we were looking for. I will move immediately to Marco. Marco, you already got a question from Domitilla, but I think what we would like to hear from you is a bit, let me say, the atmosphere within the European Union. What is I think we know what the measures which have been taken, but what do you see as the next step, and what is, if you can give us a bit the general sense of what is happening there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And I don't understand. Shall I speak in Italian or in English?
No, you keep on in English, because there are some less fluent people who are less fluent in Italian than we are. Thank you.
Okay, so very well. So anyway, first of all, thanks. This is, as you were saying, a very important occasion to exchange. It's a tough moment for everybody. Of course, Tolstoy famously referred to the fog of the war, and I think we are living this in full swing. We're in the midst of it. We are exposed to constant waves of disinformation and truth manipulation. Yesterday, I think RAI had to close its office in Moscow, and of course, already BBC and many other media outlets went. So it's very difficult to be sure about what is happening, and we have to work on approximations, in terms of approximation. But I will try and talk about things that have already happened, so to give you a bit of an idea of how basically Europe reacted to this aggression, and what are the consequences that we see in terms also, I would try and mention, in terms also of some of the main policy that the Union is confronted with, and then we'll try maybe later on to answer to Domitilla's question. So first of all, I would like to recall a point that was at the beginning quite interesting to notice from Brussels, which is that there was a divergence of a slight divergence of the intelligence coming from the US and the intelligence that we were receiving. But this divergence gradually, in the course of the month, basically cancelled itself. And what really we saw was that the US and also the Brits were trying to expose as much as possible. This is a new posture, because usually intelligence is not coming out with strong communication, exposing the facts, which is the build-up, the build-up of forces around Ukraine, and the army exercises, the joint exercise with Belarus. They were trying to expose them very clearly, consistently, so as to try and act with the deterrence effort. So I want to say that this intelligence seeming gap is more tied to a tactical attempt to deviate Putin from his route, which of course in the end we saw it didn't work. But I must say, to give you the first perception was that nobody in the EU until the 23rd of February could really work out why it would be in Putin's interest to do what he did, which is to move from occupying Donbass then to aggress Ukraine, because let's say very quickly the objectives that he could have achieved if he had stopped in Donbass, which are basically Donbass, Crimea, demilitarization, and he wanted also the end of Zelensky. Apart from the last one, he could have achieved all of those objectives, proving to be a kind of shrewd and of course ruthless tactician, and maybe we would have found an arrangement. So there was a difficult to understand why he would have to go on, in spite of all the intelligence illustrating the build-up. And so it was a moment in which the so-called Vlad the Mad theory started to come up. The analysis of these long tables where Putin would talk with these interlocutors, him never been satisfied from enough diplomatic outreach to him, Macron going there, the Americans talking to him, and this I'm just raising it because the issue about here we have a man which is going to decide is very important. So this is to say that the EU was not discarding, but was not and cannot yet really put it in the radar why these why Putin went this way. And in any case, the strategy which was taken was basically the so-called 4D strategies, which is deterrence, dialogue, de-escalation, and detent. And of course, the escalation detent fell off very rapidly, considering what he did. But in terms of deterrence, you can see that the number of restrictive measures that Europe has taken in a very short time are quite unique. We have the first round, which happened before the aggression, which basically applied to the Donbass the measures which were taken already for Crimea. But then immediately afterwards, we had the other 3 massive rounds, which were targeting Russia, and these rounds were quite massive. The attention was drawn in the debate on the SWIFT measures, but really what I would say is making a change is more the ban of the Russian central bank. The first evidence that we have is that this is really what's hitting Russia. But the measures were taken in three different rounds. Maybe I can expand then a little bit more, but they span from export control to visa, to trade, energy, and of course an impressive listing up to President Putin himself, Lavrov, the spokespersons, the Duma politicians, and then there is the air ban, which was decided on the last round, the 28th of February, listing of AD of Rosneft and Rosneft and many other companies as insurances. And then finally, on the 1st of March, also measures against Russian disinformation. The ban on Russia Today is Sputnik, and so on. Other sanctions which followed were, of course, on Belarus, because the position of Belarus in the conflict is ambiguous, but it's clear that it's participating to the attack. So this is to say we have now something like 715 individuals listed, 56 entities. And I want to stress that, of course, the restrictive measures are all based on legal acts. These are a huge number of legal texts that were prepared. We take very seriously the legal foundation of these measures, but of course this will require a big debate. But sanctions, in our ways, are to influence the behaviors. They're not considered to be as anything else. But on that, maybe we can come back. The other front on which we worked very, I would say, swiftly is international cooperation. EU-NATO decided to respond with the same letter to the first démarche of Putin, which actually was asking with a letter, you'd recall, in December, to have responses by the 27 member states. It was quite significant that Stoltenberg and Borrell actually had the support of the 27 member states to respond only with the 2 letters of the same text. The cooperation with the US, UK, Canada, and Norway was very strong throughout in terms of the mirroring of sanctions. And then, of course, there was the diplomatic outreach in the international community, which culminated with the vote in the General Assembly. Of course, the UN Security Council was prevented from acting because of the Russian veto, but the General Assembly, the resolution had 151 votes condemning, actually deploring the Russian aggression, 5 votes against, 35 abstentions. Very rapidly, the analysis of the vote shows that it's a good result. It's true, as you observed, that China and India abstained, but I would say that, of course, China is in a particular situation. China had just signed with Moscow a bilateral agreement in which it would kind of espouse a new Eurasia partnership. And I think they are not happy at all to see that their partner immediately took advantage of this kind of political agreement to aggress a country without them really being aware of. So we consider that the Russia-Chinese relations are in a difficult phase at the moment, and that Russia, especially considering that, as Domitilla was saying, the Blitzkrieg has failed, is putting China in a different position. China is the only one that can really save Russia from economical dire straits that it will find. And so it is not at all a surprise that this abstention is not a positive vote for Russia. Likewise, India has already tilted to the West a lot by joining the Quad political alliances with the US and Japan, and in neutrality. It would have been probably too much to even condemn Russia at this stage. So we think there is a logic, and maybe, well, the geography of the African votes will have to be examined well, because there is an area where probably Europe has work to do. But the others countries which voted with Russia are basically either Russia's crony like Belarus, or countries such as Syria, of course, which was Assad was saying, but the Russians, Eritrea is the same, North Korea, we don't need even to elaborate. So basically, we were a bit concerned, I must say, that the result would not be as convincing. This is a very good starting point to continue the action. We had a number of other good development internationally. I'm thinking of the action on accountability that we are taking on the International Criminal Court. I'm thinking about the decision to establish an investigative committee on human rights situation. So it seems that in spite of the outreach, the strong outreach that Russia has in many throughout the globe, the reaction that Putin has had, even diplomatically, has been tough for him. Has been I would say there is a parallel. It didn't go as well as expected diplomatically as military. Now, if I have 2 minutes to conclude, I would just mention that in the deterrence, we have to remember a decision which was taken last week on Sunday. Actually, there was a meeting of the committee and then a VTC by the foreign ministers to use for the first time very consistently what is called the European Peace Facility. Of course, it's actually an extra budget facility to be able to supply weapons to countries which are aggressed. So we also have our own, let's say, funny language. But this is a relevant thing, because I remember when I arrived to Brussels, I spent months negotiating this instrument, and basically it was thought at the beginning as something that would help us to fund operations in small African countries and be able to give some small amounts of rifles instead of giving them, sticks to train on. And now, in a matter of 24 hours, the whole budget for over on 500 million, 450 was devoted to lethal supplies to Ukrainian. There is also a debate of what it means in terms of neutrality and co-belligerence. This is the end of the taboo of use of military means. It will have repercussions in terms of on the ongoing reflection on the strategic posture of Europe. But it's clear there is no going back. On top of that, it was clarified at the EU level that this would be the basis on which other bilateral interventions may also be founded upon. So it means that the amount that will be actually dispersed in terms of supplying of weapons will be even higher. These are unprecedented actions by the EU, and they will have clearly an impact. I think we are a bit early to absorb all of this. It's been clearly a seismic shift, and we have to see how to adjust the posture of a union which has always seen itself as a normative power, as a soft power, as a regulatory power, to move it towards something else. Borrell today wrote a column on the Italian media talking about the use of power, Europe becoming a geopolitical subject. This is a challenge. There is a risk. There is a risk that this crisis, rather than pushing us forward in terms of building a European defense, would rather have some member states consider that our only safe harbor is a strengthened, let's say, exclusive NATO commitment. And there are signals in that respect, because some member states are asking to slow down the negotiations of the strategic compass, which is the document that should be finalized by the 21st of March. It's a highlight of the French presidency in the direction of having a more a strong and proactive and strategically autonomous Europe. So let's see if this crisis helps us to move forward with that, or the other way around. Of course, there will be and there are already very clear consequences on energy policies that will have to be radically and swiftly reviewed, also considering the Fit for 55 program that Europe has. Then, of course, there are reflections on the posture towards the request of adhesion of Ukraine to European Union. We know very well that we have lots of countries in the Western Balkans waiting and queuing, so the answer to Ukrainian will have to consider also that aspect. Finally, we are very worried about the impact that this is going to have on the Iranian negotiations, because we are very near to a solution. It would seem that the Russians are breaking, and so there are clearly a number of directions that we'll have to reassess. My conclusion is very simple. We are before a real clear change of paradigm as regards the security of our continent. It's difficult to now know, and we have to internalize all the changes, but we have little time. I would say also that the EU cannot waste the triple crisis that hit on our land on the 21st century, which is financial, 2008, refugees, 2015, security, 2022. I think we need to accelerate the path towards a European common defense, strengthen EU foreign policy, increase resilience in all the fields that we mentioned. And probably the question is if the time is right to move for a more federal Europe. COVID pushed us to strengthen European fiscal capacity. Likewise, Russian aggression may push us to build stronger EU defense capacity with a stronger EU military command control. Let's see how it develops, and I will stop here. And thanks a lot, Fabrizio.
No, thank you, Mark. I think that was impressive, and you know, you gave us really a 360-degree overview of the diplomatic challenges. Indeed, the thing which struck me most of all of them is indeed the use of the new instrument that you mentioned, which indeed permits the European Union to provide military help and funding, which as far as I know was never used before, and which is changing indeed the nature of our union. The ramification of this crisis, of course, are numerous, but we could talk about many other things, but I think we cannot avoid to talk about the economic consequences, the sanctions, the economic consequences towards Russia, but also vis-a-vis our own economies. Silvia, you have been working a lot on these issues, and you've done a real first-hand research on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on it today as well. So fog of war.
Thank you for spending mentioning time with
earlier. No, I think I'm just going to do 4 things. I want to maybe recap a bit what sanctions have been imposed from an economic standpoint. I want to say what I think the rationale for imposing sanctions is at this point from the West, and so how we should evaluate the success of sanctions when it comes to that particular rationale. And then I'm going to say why I think they probably won't be as successful as we're hoping unless we do something that's going to be very costly. So in terms of what the rationale is, I think, Putin was very clear in saying the other day that he considers sanctions a kind of warfare. I don't think he's wrong in that respect. I mean, clearly we're past the point where sanctions are a deterrent. I don't think anyone ever expected sanctions to be a deterrent beforehand. At this point, the question is really how fast you can undermine the key economic assumption on which I think this military operation is based, which is this idea of fortress Russia. So this idea of Russia being a kind of economy that can survive for quite a long time, isolating itself from the rest of the world because of the particular structure that the economy has. So what is that particular structure? Obviously, Russia is a commodity exporter, oil and gas in particular. So it's a country that runs in normal time a current account surplus in the order of 10% of GDP, which is really sizable. On top of that, Russia has a huge amount of international reserves, $630 billion in international reserves. So absent any kind of measures that sort of bite into that, what you have is an economy that makes so much money on what it exports and has so much international reserves accumulated that it can safely cut itself off from the rest of the world without having to reduce much its import for quite a long time, even 2 years. You could stretch it up to 2 years in terms of just the amount of reserves that they have. So what has been done on the Western side is, and this is key, to try and undermine that particular character of the Russian economy. And here, the most important sanction that has been imposed, and I agree with Marco on this one, is definitely what has been done on the side of the Russian central bank. So the Russian central bank, as I was saying, $630 billion in reserves. What is interesting is that after 2014, the composition in currency and geographical terms of these reserves has shifted quite markedly. It's shifted away from euro and dollar reserves, which used to be the predominant component, and into Chinese currency and gold, which is held at the Bank of Russia. So in a way, reserves have been progressively insulated from the risk that something like this might happen, but not enough to completely insulate the Central Bank of Russia from sanctions. So the sanctions that have been imposed by the Western allies, they effectively prevent the Bank of Russia to access almost 50% of all the reserves that it has, that it thought it could count on. And this really creates a problem for them in terms of macroeconomic management. We have seen this on Monday after the sanctions were announced. The ruble collapsed by 30% on opening in the markets, and the central bank itself was quite explicit in saying that they don't have full control of the currency anymore, that they cannot operate to stabilize the currency as they thought they could because of this sanctions that have been imposed. And this has led them to impose a number of countermeasures. Those countermeasures are effectively very strict capital controls. There are now a number of restrictions, very tight restrictions on foreign transactions, on export of foreign currencies, of sale of foreign currency, and on the operation that can be performed by Russian residents in foreign currency. Like to sum it up, if you look at all the capital controls that have been imposed, it looks like the Russian economy has done a 20 years U-turn in a way, in a macroeconomic perspective. So we're kind of back where the Russian economy was in 1998 in terms of its integration with the rest of the world. The only thing that we haven't seen yet is a sovereign default. And it's not really clear that this won't happen, because if you look at the price of the probability of that default today on the market, it's around 60%. So people really are starting to expect this to happen. And I think that the economic rationale is there because of all this these things that I mentioned before. So is this going to be enough for this measure of economic warfare to actually produce the result that we want, which is help in stopping this conflict? It depends what the time horizon is, because even if you consider all the things that I've said, so even if you consider that the Russian economy is under stress from these sanctions, and it will become progressively more under stress from the sanctions, this is going to take time. Russia has such a large current account surplus accumulated, and such a low net external debt position, that it will take months before this becomes a real point of economic pressure. So in terms of evaluating the success of these measures, it will take some time. One thing that we know, however, is that there is one part of this equation that currently is not in the sanctions that have been imposed, that could dramatically accelerate the pressure on the Russian economy. That component is import of oil and gas. So far, the measures that have been imposed, that are many and are very significant, also in historical comparison with other countries that have been sanctioned in the past, they completely carve out anything that is related to energy. That's obviously a deliberate choice that we know is coming from the import dependency of Europe in particular, but also the US in terms of the oil they import. But it's really problematic, because if you look at what the biggest component of current account surplus of the Russian economy is, that's obviously energy exports. So 50% of anything that Russian export is energy of different kinds. And so when it comes to that weapon they have from the economic standpoint, so the fact of having a large current account surplus, that's mostly related to energy payments. Energy payments, which, by the way, because we're talking about it in nominal terms, are skyrocketing right now because the price of energy is obviously increasing and is not going to go down anytime soon. So bluntly put, at the time as we speak, Russia is actually making way more money by selling energy at the prices that have skyrocketed since the invasion of Ukraine that it will ever lose from the kind of sanctions that we have imposed so far. So if sanctions are to be seen as a tool of economic warfare, there is one key weapon that's missing there, that weapon is energy. And I think without imposing energy restrictions, those sanctions will take way too long to really put pressure on the Russian economy in a way that would sort of force a resolution to this conflict. So the other side of this, the question that logically follows is how much it would cost to Europe if we wanted to take this decision. So if we really wanted to exercise this weapon of cutting ourselves off Russian energy, it's obviously going to be very expensive. So if you look at how much Russian gas accounts for in terms of all the energy consumption at the European level, substituting everything looks hardly feasible in the short run. There is a very good paper by Bruegel saying that this is actually possible if we power back on a lot of coal power energy generation, which we might do in the short run to compensate, but it's still going to be extremely expensive because a large chunk of the substitution should come through LNG, and LNG prices are obviously skyrocketing through the roof because of all the things that are happening. So if you take the prices on the market today, and you assume that you want to replace all the Russian gas that we are currently exporting in Europe with LNG, then your energy bill would multiply by 6 or 7 times easily. And the prices today are not even as high as they were back in December 2021, which is when the Russians really cut off the supply of gas to Europe, so it could get even higher. However, as I was saying, in terms of sanctions producing that outcome as a tool of economic warfare, I still think this is the one key thing that we haven't done and that we should be doing. So I think that the discussion should probably move on to acknowledging this at a European level, trying to get the US on board because cooperation on this particular issue on energy is absolutely key. And then moving on to discuss how we share the cost, how we finance this, and how we absorb this huge amount, this huge cost that's going to come from that. But in terms of the pure economic impact of sanctions, what we have today, I don't think is going to be enough to deliver what we hope that sanctions should deliver. And I think I'm going to stop there, and I can delve into any of those issues if there's questions or anyone wants to know anything more.
Thank you, Silvia. There are so many other questions, but and I've actually several, but I will restrain myself. I see there are people who are writing questions in the Zoom chat. I suggest you just ask the question directly. Just be brief and perhaps introduce yourself if you want. But who wants the floor? I saw Nicola had a couple of questions. I saw others. I may have lost the whole thread. Nicola, please. Non ti sentiamo.
Interrompo l'imbarazzo intanto, magari.
Ok, vai Carlo.
Ciao, no, volevo, I just wanted to know, all of us are sharing the concern of a possible use of nuclear tactical weapon in Europe. But I mean, what are the, other than a legitimate concern, and I like the expression about Vlad the Mad, but where is this kind of concern coming from? Some kind of intelligence, what? Some, let's say, strategy simulation of how the war field could evolve? The question is for Domitilla that raised the point initially.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you very much. I think that, first of all, tactical nuclear weapons are used in the battlefield because they have a very strong destructive power, so they can destroy a lot of the hardware of the Ukrainian armed forces and personnel very quickly. They can help to scare the Ukrainians into submission and create fear. And they can send a message that Russia is ready to escalate. So it has a variety of objectives, you know, strategic, tactical, and also signaling to the West. I think what really raised my concerns was this material that was released by Bellingcat, by the head of Bellingcat, which is an organization which I respect very much.
Yeah, Domitilla, it's good if you explain what Bellingcat is, because I'm not sure everybody is familiar with.
Bellingcat is an organization that tries to that very successfully sort of verifies information and is based a lot on geolocation. So it tries to identify where an attack comes from, who is behind a particular operation. They were very effective at identifying the individuals that were behind Navalny's poisoning, and they also orchestrated this conversation that Navalny had with his own individuals who actually had poisoned him. So they often would try, for example, they were very effective in identifying the Buk missile that shot down MH17 in 2014 in July. So they're very good at sort of utilizing geolocation mechanisms and material to sort of corroborate information. They're very serious. Some, I know they were our former students. And what really surprised me was this morning or yesterday, there was a document that was released, which seemed to have come from someone who is inside the intelligence services, and I can then pass it on. And the head of Bellingcat was arguing that he had double-checked whether this was an original document, and two of his FSB contacts confirmed that they thought this was a valid and an original document. It's very critical of Putin. It explains a lot of the chaos, and it says how much they were not prepared, and they were never told that they were going to prepare for this operation, so they couldn't prepare for and present potential scenarios. And one of the points that is raised here in this document is the fact that Narishkin, who is the head of the Foreign Intelligence Services, has been trying to find out if in Ukraine, evidence of Ukraine producing nuclear weapons, so that then they can use that as a kind of blaming it, on the Ukrainian side. So it says, at the same time, the soil is being prepared to turn everything to Ukraine. Narishkin and his foreign agents are now digging earth to prove that they were secretly creating nuclear weapons there. So that means in Ukraine. And that to me was something that really created a lot of concern. And I was hoping that somehow we could send a message to the Russians that this was a question of escalation. Christo Gosiev, the person who posted this on Twitter, when asked whether Putin would be ready to use tactical nuclear weapons, said yes. Now, again, it reminds me when with Silvia were discussing the chances of a Russian invasion, and we all thought this was absolutely crazy. And I am now in a position that I'd rather say what is in the information that is coming out. I cannot evaluate it as valid or invalid. I just think that these are issues that we need to concern, and we need to prepare a response. Let's hope it doesn't happen. But I think we are in this territory where if Putin feels very frustrated, I no longer would discard it, because I have discarded a lot of his operations, which then eventually occurred. I never expected him to go at this level of violence. I am familiar with his method of warfare. So, for example, yesterday there was a big concern because refugees from Mariupol and the humanitarian corridor was bombed. This was happening in Chechnya. So to me, this was not a surprise. But this level of escalation and his concern is something that worries me very much. And I also, if then we have time, I want to also discuss the scenario if Putin is no longer there. I think we have the hope that if Putin is not there and he's eliminated, then we would easily sort of see sort of a collapse of the entire regime. This could happen, but I'm not entirely sure, because I think there is a section of the Russian population that believes very much in this ideology of sort of great Russian imperialism. And I think this is something we are not really discussing and thinking about. And I think what is very important is to see if we find a counter narrative to that. But I'm going to stop now and allow for other questions. But I'm happy to discuss also, if you want, what is happening in Russia internally today.
But indeed, today was another, big demonstration, at least for what is allowed, and a lot of people arrested, as far as I understand. But I think Nicola, can we hear you now?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Maybe the first one is in relation to what Domitilla said. I would be interested to have the point of view of Domitilla and Marco in particular on the position of the Russian army and the Russian generals in particular, because I, like Domitilla, I've given up any hope on Putin, but I'm still having some hope on the rationality of the militaries. And the second question is, and then I will stop, it's a question for all the panelists, and it moves from the conflict to the economy, which is, what are the chances of the G20 surviving this crisis?
Marco, you wanna start?
Shall I? So thank you. I see. Let me start by the question of Roberto that I see in the chat. He says the market works on expectations. Putin understands power. Are there any chances that we take a decision on EU defense? I think this is an important point. It's one of the deliverables of the French presidency. It's a moment where, for the first time, European defense can advance because of a crisis. We have the EPF revolutionary decision that has been taken. A number of decisions that would have not passed the scrutiny of parliament are being approved. And this would be a very important political gesture to complement what is being done with the unity on sanctions. And this would give would confirm the firmness with which Europe is going to raise to the challenge. I would then want to respond to Silvia's comments about the kind of economy war, and just ring a word of caution on the fact that, of course, there is always another sanction to be added and another restrictive measures to be imagined. But let's first of all understand that we have already issued a big many number of measures. We are implementing them and they are actually working. We don't need to go into a direct, immediate economic war. We don't even want it. We want to influence the behavior somehow by making it clear that this is the decline for Russia's economy. I think our speaker have made the point that this is a leap backwards of 20 years. This will have to percolate to all levels of societies of Russia. We think it can happen. It's very important that we keep trying to have some outreach, and don't forget the Russian civil societies. We know how much the repression has been strong, but we want some channels of communication to remain open. This is why we have said that we don't want to close our embassies, our offices in Moscow for the time being. The question about G20, yes, G20 is going to probably go through a period of let's say, forced freeze, but these formats are of a highly informal nature, and they respond to political stimulations. And somehow, of course, the format reflects the need for coordination on global issues among the big players. This need will remain. Russia's army's position and rationalities of Russian armies. There is a lot to be said about that. It is clear, as Domitilla was saying, that we cannot discard any decisions from Putin's, having seen the ruthlessness of the last choices. But it's true that the apparatus can see things more near to reality, and it's clear that the news from the military and economic fronts are pretty negative for Russia, and this will have to emerge. And I think it's part of our effort to be able to communicate that. Ultimately, this will help us to raise the stakes so high that something may happen within the regime. Of course, this is a very unpredictable process. I don't know if there was any other question. I think I can give you back.
Thank you, Marco. Perhaps just Domitilla, on the briefly on the issue of the army, and more generally, if we can broaden the question asked by Nicola, where some opposition, or perhaps a decisive opposition to Putin rule can come from? Is there any quarter that you see that could be determined, brave, bold, and powerful enough to top him?
Siamo appena rientrati. Guarda qua che abbiamo controllato.
Scusate, mute. Okay, grazie. Domitilla, please.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I mean, the only institution where I would see, and I would hope that would be in a position to challenge Putin is the military structures themselves. They are really bearing the brunt of this operation. They have a high number of civilian casualties. Yes, I think it was yesterday or on Friday, we saw in Parliament Ludmila Narusova, who is she's the widow of Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg, and Putin was working as a deputy mayor to Sobchak. So this lady is the wife of his ex-boss in St. Petersburg, and she was talking about casualties, you know, and about a company of 100 men, only 4 having survived. So it's clear that those who are really suffering from this war are going to put pressure on the government. There's organizations of soldiers' mothers, and the pressure is going to mount if the casualties increase. And so I don't know if we're going to see changes within the internal military structure, that Putin sort of dismisses some of his generals and replaces them, or the generals are going to tell him that there is no possibility of winning this war, which is still a possibility. I'm not discarding that. So I wouldn't see an opposition from within the security structures, the FSB, but more from the military themselves. But at the moment, we don't see any breaking of ranks. What is interesting, if it has been corroborated, is that I think it's the Deputy Defense Minister of Belarus sent a letter of resignation. So there is certainly concerns inside Belarus about the fact that Belarus became engaged in the conflict and probably around the question of casualties. As we know, the Russian armed forces have serious logistic problems, and they're losing a lot of men. It's you know, the whole way this war is being fought is creating a lot of problems. I think internally, we know that, I mean, we tend to look a lot at the demonstrations and all those who have come out in you know, against the war, but I'm also looking at reports of those who are also coming in support of the war. And there is information, and there are a lot of pictures of those who are supporting the war with using the letter Z as a sort of as a sign of support. There is a lot of pressure. Apparently, children in a school or in an orphanage were asked to come out in the street and draw a Z with their own sort of bodies, you know, standing together. So there is probably pressure of people having to show that they're in favor of the war by providing signs of this Z in the cars or in their work or in their posting. But at the same time, Russia is really closing up politically. There is a lot of a lot of pressure on those who demonstrate. A lot of them are detained. I think yesterday only another 4,000 people. or today, if I'm not mistaken. There are closure of all the opposition or liberal media. It's not there anymore. Echa Moskvi, TV Dost, Nova Gazeta, the editor was, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. And also a lot of cutoff of social media. And with that in combination with the blockage that is coming from outside, is really bringing Russia to a position of sort of North Korea. And I think, I'm not sure if the Russian middle class is going to resist that and just stay quiet. I'm sure that the oligarchs are putting a lot of pressure on Putin, and I would be very, very surprised if there isn't people like Anatoly Chubais, who was a minister, or who was in charge of privatizations in the 1990s and was close to Putin and has remained of the old guard of people who would put pressure. Kudrin, who was a finance minister, people that are not necessarily oligarchs, but people who have participated in governmental decision-making, who are not trying now to say, to tell Putin, that this is maybe over. So I don't discard that he's under pressure and that people are really talking about whether this is really something they want to pursue till the end. That I wouldn't discard it. What we don't know, if this is going to be sort of the moment of 1905 when the government realizes that they really need to, retreat from this operation and cut their losses. I don't think we have reached this sort of hurting point where Putin says, okay, we'll give it up, because in a way it's only maybe 10 days, not even. And he might argue that he can carry on. But as we see, a lot of the problem is the problem of logistics and supplies. And if you look at the images, they're starting to rely on cars and on buses to provide supplies. I mean, this is something quite extraordinary. And we are only 10 days in the war. So I think that there were also reports that Russia was really not going to be able to carry out effectively this war. That is why I'm also worrying about the escalation. So it's this combination of what we used to call with Iraq catastrophic success, from our perspective, at a very high price, and who knows how this is going to develop. But what I also would like to highlight, if I have a moment, is that Russia, the government of Russia and Putin have been nurturing this sort of patriotic education and patriotic sort of sentiment among the young and many individuals. And this is not only limited to the security structures. If you listen to Russian television, most of the of those who participate in these debates, and I've been hearing them for many years now, many have taken this very strong nationalist position. I mean, the editor of RT, Margarita Simonian. I mean, these are people that are very vocal and very vociferous. And maybe they're also putting pressure on Putin to say, go on, don't stop now, because if not, the whole Russian state will collapse. I think that he has to evaluate all these different aspects. But it's certainly not going well for him, and I'm sure he's fully aware and quite worried about it.
Well, I think that leads us actually to Silvia, because my question is, you are somehow a bit skeptical about the sanctions and their effectiveness. At the same time, as you said, we have been basically the collapse of the Russian financial sector. I mean, Russia is probably didn't have one of the largest financial sector in the world, but still is quite a sophisticated country with with a stock exchange, with a very sophisticated bank, with a very sophisticated central bank led by Nabiulina, who was very well respected and authoritative. And in basically 2 days after the G7 communique, and I would stress that G7, so Japan is indeed part of it, the whole system collapsed. What is the rationale beyond what you're saying? Are you saying that this is just the financial sector and will not have an impact on the daily life of the ordinary Russian, and therefore it will take time to this crisis to trickle down to the normal people?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, if you look at what has been done domestically so far, for example, to compensate the impact of what we have seen on the financial side on real income, there's been an increase in pensions that's been actually higher than inflation so far. Now, the question you may ask is how long are they going to be able to continue to do this? And not for very long, but again, it depends what our horizon for expecting success from these measures really is. So how much time we think we have to allow sanctions to play out in the way that we expect them to play out. And I think, I mean, obviously the impact that you've seen on financial market is striking, the collapse of the currency. They closed the exchange, a lot of capital controls being reintroduced, but then all these measures, the fact that they're closing down the economy, the fact that they did this 20-year jump back in terms of macroeconomic situation, that is all intended to buy time. And the way you take that time away is by taking away the sources of foreign currency that allows them to pay their debt. And the most immediate and the most forceful way to do that is taking away the biggest component of the current account surplus that Russia is running, which is energy. So I think, I'm not saying, I want to make this very clear, I'm not saying that the sanctions are useless. I'm saying it really depends on how much time we think we have for sanctions to really have an effect, to reach that point where you do have an economic trigger point, because I don't think we're there yet.
Point taken, point taken. And this is why you suggest that we should move to the next level, which is
like the energy question, I think, is way more complicated than that. I think it's become very clear in this crisis that dependence on Russia energy for Europe in particular, but not only, is a very constraining geopolitical condition to place yourself in. And I think that's pretty evident, because I mean, even if you think at the whole debate about the SWIFT ban, it was all about energy. It was all about ensuring that we could keep a channel to pay for energy, and that's precisely what has been done. Because it's true that we have imposed very remarkable sanctions on the Russian banking system, but the European sanctions on SWIFT do not include Sberbank, do not include Gazprom Bank. And I can only see one reason for that exception, but Sberbank is the biggest Russian bank. So if we really wanted to go hard on the banks, we probably should have included Sberbank. In the EU side of the international payment system sanctions, if you look at the US did sanction Sberbank. It did prevent Sberbank from access to accounts, correspondent accounts in the US. So that basically limits what they can do in terms of foreign transactions, but energy transactions are exempted. So when we look at those measures, we shouldn't just focus on the headlines. We shouldn't just focus on X number of banks being sanctioned by the EU, the G7, or whoever. We should actually look at what is sanctioned and what is exempted from sanctions. And so far, the biggest source of income for Russia, the biggest component of the current account that Russia is running, is not sanctioned in any way. Now, there's a question that you might, there's another point that you may actually raise, which I think is very interesting, which is oil, for example, is sort of self-sanctioning itself. Because as a side effect of all the sanctions that have been imposed, it's becoming more and more difficult for Russia to find cargoes to export its oil. 60% of Russian oil is exported by sea. So obviously cargoes are a very important element to that, and it's becoming way more and more difficult to insure those cargoes, and therefore those cargoes cannot actually ship. So in a way, this is perhaps an unintended.
Is applied as well on the price.
And the discount is applied because obviously it becomes more difficult to
the euro
to trade
is less, I think it's 10% lower than.
It's 10% less than correspondent.
Yeah, but given that the price has been increasing so much, I mean, perhaps they don't feel that. Marco, you want to comment on that? So, sorry if I cut you off, Silvia. Marco.
Yes, thank you. I want to comment a second, because I'm a bit concerned that this debate on the sanctions that, again, are not the final solution, makes us lose the perspective. Sanctions are part of a response which has to be wider. First of all, we have to work for the narrative that this is an aggression, that Russia is isolated, and that nothing good will come out of this policy making. Sanctions will do their work, and they are doing an excellent work in terms of pressures, but we don't have from one day to the next to just cut off with Russia all the relations. This wouldn't be reasonable. Second point, we don't just have to be reactive and think, what is Russia doing next? We have to prepare at the unions level, at bilateral levels. We have to also discuss with the public opinions. I think it's important. We have to push for a new awareness of the type of challenges that we will be confronted with in the next 10, 20 years, because security has become, and has come back, and has to become a concern for the European member states. And this debate has to find a solution and a political answer. And we have to prove that we can be resilient on that, because nobody knows, unfortunately, how long this will take. So again, this means working in various directions, internally, internationally, and also economically. But let us not, I mean, first of all, more sanctions will probably come in the following days. I don't exclude that, nobody can exclude any of those that have been mentioned, but let's not belittle all that has been done and find that we know we are somehow not doing it. After all, the ruble went down by 40%, we know very well. Interest rate is doubled. The spread is 8 times before it was. The problems are there. And what is even more significant, and I'll close on that, is all the big brand shops that are leaving Russia. The isolation of Russia from cultural, musical, sport events, all this gives a signal that Putin has trespassed a red line. And this signal, even the Bolshoi director just mentioned that he would leave. This signal, we think, can reach to the population that in the end will make the difference and will maybe cause Putin's to go. So all these things we have to bear in mind. And of course, at the moment where for the first time we're even considering military support, we should not only consider economic war, military support, but try and keep the perspective that also dialogue and talks are still there, and until the war is not over, there is a possibility, and we should make as much as possible to end it. Back to you. Thank you.
Point taken. I think we are going toward the end of our webinar today. It's just my role to thank all participants. We were quite numerous indeed, but in particular, I would like to thank Marco, Silvia, and Domitilla once more for their wisdom and their experience. They provide us with a first-hand view of what is happening in Ukraine and in Russia, and also within the European Union and the West in reacting to the brutal aggression of the Russian territory, of the Ukrainian territory. Let me say that we will abuse of your time again if you allow us, and we would like to keep that format. And perhaps we will reconvene in a better time, hopefully shortly. Thank you everybody. Bye bye.
Grazie mille, arrivederci.
Ciao, grazie a tutti.
Grazie, arrivederci. Buona serata.
Grazie.